Welcome, everyone. I'm Dion Ferris, President of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, coming to you from Glasgow, Scotland, and COP26. Thank you all who are joining us in the audience today for All In on Equity, which is a United States Climate Action Center virtual event.
Yeah, there's going to have to be a progress bar. Like, you have to post your progress.
At the Institute for Sustainable Communities, our vision and commitment and mission are to equitable climate change interventions for all communities and just transition for workers and communities, especially for marginalized peoples and people who are the hardest hit by climate change and environmental degradation. At the Institute, we're committed to helping communities and local leaders shape, drive, and implement equitable, green, low-emission economic solutions. Today, we're pleased to be speaking with Ms. Shalanda Baker and Mr. Vivek Adia. Shalanda is the Secretarial Advisor on Equity and the Deputy Director for Energy Justice in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the United States Department of Energy. We're speaking with Shalanda today about the transition to equity-centered action on climate change. Prior to her appointment at the Energy Department, Ms. Baker was a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University. Her career championing equity for communities on the front lines of climate change includes over a decade conducting research on the equity dimensions of the global transition away from fossil fuel energy to cleaner and renewable energy resources. Today, Shalanda will share perspectives on energy and environmental justice in the administration of the United States President, Joe Biden. Vivek is my colleague at the Institute for Sustainable Communities. Vivek Adia is the country director for the Institute's programs in India. Before joining the Institute, Vivek created and led the World Resources Institute's India Climate Program. Vivek has a master's in business administration from the University of Pune, and he's a prolific contributor to the Times of India newspaper. Today, Vivek will share perspectives and experiences regarding climate change from the vantage point of the Global South. Welcome, Shalanda and Vivek, and everyone in the audience who joins us today. Shalanda, again, my thanks for joining us in the midst of your busy schedule at COP26. Yesterday, you led a powerful and informative session in the United States Climate Action Pavilion focused on equitable decarbonization. Your roundtable focused on the Biden-Harris administration's historic Justice 40 initiative and the ways the initiative is changing the United States government's approach. You mentioned being at COP25 in Madrid 2 years ago and equity being on the fringes at that time. I'm sure wondering, how does it feel at COP26 seeing equity spoken about so much during these international discussions?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much, Dion, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And Vivek, it's really lovely to meet you as well. I see you're over at the venue with lots of business happening behind you. And, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks yesterday, I was at COP25. I led a delegation of students there, and, you know, we were observers. And all of the most exciting conversations were really happening in side events, you know, and there was a focus on equity for women, equity for tribal communities and indigenous peoples. But it never made it inside, you know, never made it inside the negotiations or into the broader conversation. And it certainly wasn't a part of the US pavilion. And so for me, it's just such an honor to kick off the day yesterday with a panel on the most historic initiative that I think we have ever seen. At least I can say that, you know, on the federal government side. So it was great. It was an honor. It was exciting. I mean, I got chills just hearing you ask me the question, because I don't think it's been done. And so I think we're in a unique moment. There's a lot of excitement around us, and people realize that this is the time to act on equity and climate, and we have to do it together.
Thank you so much. We use language like communities that need it most and disinvested communities and marginalized communities. Shalanda, share some of your thoughts for our audience about exactly how these terms should be defined. What do we mean?
Oh, sure. Well, so, the language that is spelled out in Executive Order 14008 uses the term disadvantaged communities. And a lot of people have bristled against that term because disadvantaged communities suggest that there's something accidental or sort of inherent about that community that makes it disadvantaged. I think we need to get really clear about the ways in which, the communities have not received the same sort of government attention, not received the same types of investments from the private sector, and really name that. And terms that are now more frequently used are underserved communities, as you said, disinvested communities, really pointing to the actions that led to the current circumstances. I think, we're talking about communities that experience cumulative burdens and a raft of harm. So these are environmental justice communities. So communities that are disproportionately exposed to toxins. You know them very well, Dion. So communities that are disproportionately exposed to toxins, communities that also have a high amount of climate hazards, and they also experience resilience issues, so access to power. In the case of the Department of Energy, we are also looking at these types of communities as communities that also have high energy burden. Other agencies also look at things like transportation burden, housing burden. We want to look at the range of socioeconomic features in a community that make them, that uniquely situate them within the economy. And so it's cumulative in my view.
Thank you for sharing that. Vivek, I want to ask you the same question pertaining to the Global South. What do you think about defining this language? Disinvested communities, marginalized communities, communities that need the help most, and the terms that Shalanda just shared with us, underrepresented communities, underserved communities. How does this language play out in the Global South?
Thank you, Dion, and very happy to be here. And Shalanda, very inspiring, always in awe of your leadership when you're bringing this mainstream into the equity context. Dion, to your question, all of these terms, even the Global South has been grappling with when we talk about disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, communities on the front lines, in the line of fire. All of these have been different terminologies that have been used based on different reactions that climate impacts have caused. And what I really believe is, maybe if there is a way to bring in a more solution-oriented context as well to defining these. When we say, I was just thinking about it, and I've been hearing this a lot. When you miss a voice, you miss a solution. And so maybe somewhere, if we are able to look at this from an unheard or not having a seat at the table kind of a connotation, we are also losing out on that solution. So when we define all of this, we should also keep in mind that this is not just what we are trying to help the disadvantaged or marginalized or communities in the line of fire to become more resilient, become more empowered, but also there is a wealth of solutions that lie because they can come up with really innovative solutions that could be effective and scalable. So that's what I would try and add from Shalanda's points.
Thank you so much. So turning back to you, Shalanda, here's a question with a little bit of context. Colleagues on your panel yesterday spoke about some really interesting and important equity-centered projects. The panel that you moderated yesterday in the United States Climate Action Center spoke about really interesting and important equity-centered projects, both projects that are planned and projects that are currently underway. It was really exciting to hear. Tell us what it's like operationally to see that work unfold, and share your thoughts, if you will, about how major climate change actors are responding to this shift.
Sure. So, I think one of the things that there were two things that really resonated for me yesterday, among many things that were really important. One is, the need for bottom-up engagement in all of the work that we're doing. And then I think two, the challenge of implementation. And Dr. Beverly Wright ended our panel by saying that implementation is going to be the biggest challenge. I think there's so much excitement right now around the federal family, about all of the initiatives, about the climate legislation that we hope will get passed soon, about the infrastructure bill. And, we have been engaging stakeholders for a while on this. And so they're also excited and really ready for huge investments in their communities. So it's exciting to see places like DOT, the Department of Transportation, speak in specificity about how they are dismantling structural racism. For DOT, structural racism is visible in the way that we designed our highway system. And so, the legislation provides money for them to bring communities together, because that, the design of our highway system created and led to a lot of the divisions, the economic divisions that we see in community, which were often racial in nature. So it's exciting. Big ideas are out there right now. And I think communities are expecting this. They want us to go big. And as Dr. Wright said, the devil will be in the details, and we have to be, really patient as we do the implementation process.
Well, certainly with your reference to the United States Department of Transportation, it really is wonderful to see President Biden's whole of government approach and sister agencies at the federal level working together. And we know you're in the heart and soul of making that happen. Thank you very much. We'll dig into bottom up in just a few more minutes.
Okay.
So Vivek, a similar question for you. The Institute for Sustainable Communities programs in India center equity across our work in places and spaces such as regenerative agriculture, clean energy, environmental management, and sustainable supply chains and sustainable manufacturing. So share with us operationally how that work is unfolding and how people and governmental officials in India are responding.
Thank you, Dion. And I'd like to draw a parallel from the whole of government approach to a whole of ecosystem approach back here in the global south, and especially in India. What has really been happening now, and this is the change that Shalanda was mentioning again, as compared to the COP meetings earlier. Sometimes we wonder that the people who are the hardest hit are not even in Glasgow, and how do you really get them a seat at the table and work towards it? But what this reflects back from the work that the Institute for Sustainable Communities has been doing is building in local enabling ecosystems and trying to bring in the whole of that stakeholder mapping together. What we are trying to do is work across communities, farmers, cities, and local organizations and small and medium businesses to really bring them into the entire fold for decision making. And what we've been really seeing is we've been working with 150,000 farmers, and most of them have been women or smallholder farmers who traditionally did not have a say in decision making, whether it's in terms of what cropping patterns to follow, what kind of land use to do, what kind of water usage and conservation needs to be done, how this reflects to livelihoods and so on and so forth, while the majority of the work had been done by women farmers and smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers means owning a land piece less than a football field for that matter. So that's the kind of fragmentation that we are seeing. And when we bring them together with factual evidence, with data, with a larger engagement, where they're having a seat for decision making that really drives a lot of difference. We've been also working with some of the smallest, most fragile businesses who've been really struggling with day-to-day cash flows and who do not have like more than 5 or 6 people employed. But collectively, these small and medium enterprises form a huge section of India's industry space, and they contribute a lot there. And how we are able to help them access finance, access technology, and look at the cleanest, greenest, and the safest methods of production. And this is something you can only do when you're able to make this like an inclusive ecosystem where you bring them together, have them into the decision making, and then plan this out in terms of how things would be rolled out when you're looking at these big announcements or programs that talk about, just like what Prime Minister Modi announced earlier. And all of these have been really aimed at bringing in the uninitiated into the mainstream conversations.
Thank you so much for sharing that set of experiences, Vivek. Now I want to set the stage a little bit for my next question. It's important to know that the work of President Biden's administration and his Justice 40 initiative are tackling the historic wrongs of racial inequities and economic inequities and disinvestment that communities are experiencing. At the same time, really upping the ante on investing in community engagement and input. Ultimately, what we're doing here at COP26 is entering into the conversation, the criticality of building community resilience. The Institute for Sustainable Communities provides infrastructure, technical assistance, and support that build the capacity of communities, governments, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, among other key stakeholders. We're conveners, bringing together racially and culturally diverse networks, and we help interdisciplinary stakeholders grapple with equity at the same time we're grappling with ecological degradation, what Vivek just called the whole ecosystem approach. This work requires acknowledgement of the harms and the disproportionate impacts on people who are the hardest hit by environmental, economic, and social impacts. Our work incorporates inclusion of the voices and interests of people harmed most. That is one of our foremost priorities. Now, with that said, Shalanda, yesterday, Christopher Coe from the United States Department of Transportation very succinctly articulated this, and I quote, "If you're going to address climate, you have to address equity. If you're going to address equity, you have to address climate," unquote. This articulation is pretty much our mantra at the Institute for Sustainable Communities. There is no true sustainability without equity. Hearing about the holistic nature of President Biden's whole of government approach is extraordinarily encouraging for all of us working alongside you in the field. Are you finding that the engagement from your federal colleagues has increased because of this approach? And what kind of internal feedback are you hearing from your colleagues?
Yeah, so the first thing out of anyone's mouth right now is about stakeholder engagement. So stakeholder engagement is absolutely key to our success. It will be absolutely key to our success with Justice 40. And so everybody understands this conceptually, right? That we have to talk to communities to learn what their hopes and dreams are as we are doing this transition work. The challenge, though, is that we need to upskill, right? And the government isn't always the best kind of party for stakeholder engagement. So, we're doing a lot of training. We're working with our colleagues to let them know kind of what the best practices are around stakeholder engagement. And of course, many people around the federal family do this really well, including EPA, who was on the panel yesterday. And so we're trying to learn from them, as well as other agencies like the Department of Interior. And we also have expertise at DOE, including my office. I mean, we do stakeholder engagement in the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, as well as the Office of Indian Energy, led now by Wahala Johns, who's just been named director. So we have some great people around the agency, some offices that are already doing this, but it is absolutely a challenge for many. And so folks are excited. We definitely want to do this right, because as you said at the beginning, Dion, this is the only way we're going to succeed and win on Justice 40 and on an equitable transition. But we also have to make sure we know how to do the stakeholder engagement. So that's really a part of the work as well.
Thank you very much. Question for you, Vivek. Tuesday this week, and we were all gratified to hear it, India's Prime Minister Modi committed right here at COP26 to produce 450 gigawatts of power through solar and other renewable energy resources by 2030. How are the government ministries in India working to lift up equity at greater levels, particularly in this energy space?
Thank you, Dion. And just building up on that announcement, what I really think is Prime Minister Modi and his government truly understands the interlinkages of energy, climate, and development. And when we go back to a situation that India is in, when 200 million people lack access to formal electricity, and an equivalent amount are there below the poverty lines. And how do you really provide energy for all and do that with renewables, do that with the lowest cost possible? And some of those announcements and the administration's work, the government's work revolves around all of this. We keep talking about net zero, but when manufacturing needs to go to net zero, can it afford to ignore the small and medium enterprises? When we talk about sustainable landscapes and food systems and net zero agriculture for that matter, can it really transition towards that path without understanding the nuances of smallholder and women farmers that we were looking in? And I'm so glad and happy that some of this transition is being really thought through in greater detail. And while the country is pledging or wanting to move away from coal, it is also making sure that some of the most disadvantaged communities who have their entire livelihoods dependent on coal suddenly do not end up without jobs or look at it. So there is a big program that is being discussed with the World Bank, a $1 million initiative that the government is looking at. On the energy side, again, there is this big alliance that's being launched, which looks at the energy for people and how does this really drive solutions like distributed, because the moment you go off grid, you are able to bring in a larger section of communities who traditionally lack access to mainstream electricity and grid. And when you provide that, you provide them livelihood opportunities, education, finance, market access, and a whole lot of things that come in together with. So that's the thing that's being looking at. Even from a subnational level, the city where I come from, Mumbai, has just launched its climate action plan looking at net zero, but it is doing that with extensive consultations on what this means for indigenous people in Mumbai, for the migrants in Mumbai, for the different cosmopolitan community setup that's been developed. And I don't think any other climate action plan for a city has looked at this from the equity lens, because you can really plan out the infrastructure, you can plan out the energy transitions, but if you don't understand the unintended consequences on people and start planning towards that, then we wouldn't be in a space for what is called a just transition. So that's some of the examples what the government is doing here, and we are keeping a close watch and trying to support them the right way.
Thank you for that, Vivek. I want to stay with you just for a moment. I'd love for you to share with our audience and with Shalanda a little bit about our wonderful P4G project and how that is bringing together the cross-section of the right stakeholders to deal with this whole ecosystem approach.
Thank you, Dion. So we are doing this project where we are helping MSMEs transition towards cleaner manufacturing. And these are the industries who traditionally do not have access to finance or technology or even skills or capacity to do this. And I was just talking about the MSMEs in India. 97% of these MSMEs do not have regular access to electricity. And almost 50% of them rely on dirty diesel generators to power their production lines. And about 30% of their entire costs are spent on energy. And you imagine when you have zero or almost negligible margins, operating margins, and the likelihood of really capital deployment diminishing upfront. So what we've been doing is we've been bringing innovative finance where these MSMEs are able to aggregate their demand, build in scale of what technologies could be rolled out, but at the same time, access financing, which enables them to repay based on the energy savings that they'll be able to bring out from the different initiatives, rather than really get burdened by the upfront capital investments, which they are not able to make. So it's like a pay as you save model that's been going out. There is capital which is being de-risked with philanthropy, and then it boosts in a $1 million credit line, $1 million capital is unleashing a market of $15 million. That's equivalent to taking 12 million cars off the road. And also it is powering 5,000 middle-income households from the savings that we've been able to achieve. So that's the kind of impact where we are bringing in local innovations on how do we really bring in finance, make it more accessible to people who do not have deep pockets or strong credits, but are willing to undergo through this transition, and also offer skilling and capacity and bring technology right next to their door, instead of them being able to depend on some of the large centers of science and tech.
Dion, you can't just have him do that and not give me the opportunity to
take it away.
I'm just so fascinated by that. I mean, I'm a finance nerd in some ways. Prior to becoming a law professor, I was a project finance lawyer and looked at the Grameen Bank. And, it's so interesting that you're doing this innovation and an innovative finance model in India, which was kind of the home, the birthplace of the Grameen Bank model. Just a quick question on the aggregation piece, and would love to follow up after this as well. How does default work? If there are any defaulting issues that happen within the broader pool of borrowers there?
Vivek?
And this is super in the weeds.
That's where the key that's the key to open the lock, right, to finance, and we've been able to secure this with negligible defaults because there are three mechanisms that people could adopt to. There is a revolving fund that's been created which looks at the first loss and is able to absorb some of these things. There is an insurance mechanism that's built in, and then there is a partial risk guarantee. That's another way that's been built up. So there is a combination which makes sure that the mainstream capital that comes in does not face any defaults, because the moment it is default, the entire initiative goes for a toss and we are not able to achieve those benefits. So there are these buffers that we've built in, and that's the key to the lock, if I may say that.
Interesting. Great. Thank you.
So some people in our audience might be wondering why micro and small and medium enterprises are one of the foci of our work in India. And I just want to reinforce that it's about just transition. These are businesses that are smaller, that need help. These are businesses where the owners of the enterprises are from the community and they're hiring people in the community. And as we talk about the convergence of environment, social, economic, and health, we want to make sure that we're building businesses at the same time that we're creating and supporting and sustaining green jobs. So I talked a little bit earlier about getting back to the bottom-up approach. So Shalanda, here you go. Another question. On the panel yesterday, presenter that you moderated so excellently, thank you very much. Presenters framed the work in a way that we at the Institute for Sustainable Communities intimately understand. They talked about the bottom-up approach, saying that starting at the community level is the only way to make solutions stick. At the Institute, like you, we know from experience that partnering with community-led organizations is the most effective way to develop and ensure the implementation of equitable approaches that work. It sounds like many federal agencies, and you're in the leadership around this now, it sounds like many federal agencies are navigating how best to get to that bottom-up engagement and how to move that work now. Please share with our audiences, if you will, how's that working with you and for you?
Yeah, so I think about the Justice 40 Initiative, and every office that has a stake in the game, right, a dog in the fight, is a part of this broader conversation. We have a community of practice for Justice 40 that may sound kind of fluffy, but it's actually the place where the real work is getting done, where we're engaging our programs on a bi-weekly basis, but really daily on the Justice 40 Initiative, talking to them about the stakeholder engagement and outreach that needs to happen as a result of this initiative. But we've also done our own stakeholder engagement to sort of get a sense from movement leaders as to what they need, because we know that movement leaders are really the experts. They know exactly, what their communities want, and they know the hopes and dreams of their communities. And so we love hearing from them because they are the experts. And so we've done a series of stakeholder engagements, mainly throughout the summer and early fall. And now we're sort of seeping into our DOE fabric to train and, help our DOE colleagues understand more about the importance of stakeholder engagement as well as how to do it. And so we'll be rolling.
Of the Global South, talk a little bit about how the bottom-up approach works in India.
Thank you. And I think, what I would allude to my first point in terms of solutions, rather than being, looked at the hardest hit. And what this really means is that in India, what we've seen based on our work, some of the most cutting edge, innovative, scalable solutions have come in bottom up. And I'll just give an example of our work with the women farmers on cotton cultivation. And cotton is amongst the largest produced in the country. It also consumes twice as much water as compared to the global average. And it's very sensitive to the climate impacts in that sense. So what really is happening is more and more area of cotton cultivation is under huge stress because of high exposure, high sensitivity, and less adaptive capacity. Now, what we've done is really brought in all of that data and inputs and modeling with community-based participation that really maps it into a nice vulnerability index, which really tells you that it's not just dependent on rainfall patterns or changes in precipitation, but it also depends on how this would impact the rain-fed farmer versus an irrigated farmer versus a woman farmer or a smallholder farmer. A 1 degree rise would impact very differently to an irrigated farmer. A 10% change in precipitation would impact, again, in a very different way with a different constituency. And what we've really seen is the solutions are being built up from these communities themselves. So they are doing double sowing, triple sowing. They're using different approaches for production, using more natural, low input, chemical free agriculture, and in turn saving not just water, saving not just money or cost of cultivation, but also making themselves more resilient to the climate impacts that comes in. And now with this solution-oriented stuff, it's going back into state level action planning on how the entire agriculture program is being thought through. And so that's the kind of bottom-up feed in to a large-scale action that's been going on.
Thank you. Now let's take this back to COP26. Another roundtable in yesterday's lineup, featured United States government officials, and it focused on advancing adaptation and mitigation efforts on the ground level across the globe. The United States isn't exempt from these efforts. We see the effects of extreme weather events in our neighborhoods and in the news every day. Share with us, Shalanda, if you will, please, some of the most difficult challenges you're running across and what you view as some of our best opportunities to get a handle on this work in anticipating our collective efforts to build resilience in underrepresented and underserved communities across this country.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's just so much that's happening that is really wonderful right now. I, again, just want to highlight the Justice 40 initiative, which promises 40% of the benefits of climate and clean energy investments, which are mitigation strategies, right? These are mitigation investments. These are also, in some ways, adaptation investments. We're going to be investing in clean water infrastructure, sustainable housing, as well as cleanup. And so 40% of the benefits of all of those investments have to go to frontline communities. And I like that Vivek introduced that term because it's also one that I often use. These are the communities that are on the front lines of environmental hazards, as well as the front lines of climate. And so there are a lot of challenges, and again, building on something that Vivek just said, regarding the granularity and the spatial resolution of those investments. A lot of our modeling efforts around decarbonization are in the aggregate. And so we can do big scale modeling, right? What is the national, how many gigawatts do we need to sort of transform the transportation sector into a clean energy sector, right? And so on and so forth. And you can do that in housing, you can do that in, just buildings writ large, and it's all massive, right? But what does it look like when you take those gigawatts, transform them into megawatts and kilowatts and get them at the household level or the building level, right? That's a challenge. That's a scientific modeling challenge, but it also takes our social scientists who understand communities. It takes communities as well who understand, what the footprint should be and where things should be, the siting issues. And so that's, again, why the partnerships between, the scientists and government officials that are doing this work and communities is so important. And we know that a lot of our tools, from the tools of decarbonization to the tools of the census, are really just too blunt to help us understand what's happening on the ground. So that's the biggest challenge. I think another challenge is when we think about investments and investments going into a place, those investments are not always positive for a community. And this is particularly true in our EJ communities, our environmental justice communities, where there is already cumulative harm. There's already a lot of infrastructure. And so solutions for a rural community that might be interested in manufacturing or other types of investments are very different from solutions that a community in an urban area might be interested in. And so scaling solutions, understanding at a granular level what types of solutions and how to implement those solutions, those are key questions. And then also just understanding that an investment in a community is not always the beneficial thing. So lots of work, lots of opportunity. I mean, again, if their Build Back Better and infrastructure packages make it through Congress, which we really hope they do, we have a phenomenal opportunity to really think about development and think about this transition in totally different ways. So very exciting.
Thank you very much for that. And I apologize.
Yes,
I got a little frog in my
okay?
got a little frog in my throat there.
I
but I'm fine. I'm just fine. Now,
Good.
let's keep it moving.
Okay.
So here's my closing question before we open the floor to questions and discussion from our audience. At the Institute for Sustainable Communities, again, we really understand the significance of these on-the-ground approaches, and we really do believe and execute around the bottom-up approach to problem solving. Collaborating with communities, understanding what's happening in the community, the assets and the needs, and solving from there is the only way.
I'm not sure. Vivek, do you want to kick that one off?
Okay, maybe I'll try and make an attempt. And so what we've been seeing here at COP26, and Shalanda, to your point, there's so much happening and so much positive stuff is going on as compared to the last few years. But, if I look at just one profound point that can just add up and accelerate this transition is integrating equity into all these different platforms that are coming out. So when you look at net zero, when you look at 2050 pathways, when you look at so many of these things, I don't think each of these platforms integrate the equity and community context in the entire space. Of course, there is some attempt here and there. So I think it would be nice to look at it. And that just brings me to the development question and the climate action point of view. And when we were working with businesses and some of the large business announcements that came in, the only thing that we were looking at is how do you really move from a do no harm or a do minimal impact or minimal damage to a more positive contribution that really transforms communities and their development journey and their access. Because gone are the days, it's all passe if you're just restricting and saying, I will do net zero damage or I will do no harm. But how can you really positively contribute and advance, whether on building resilience, building livelihoods and stuff? That's where the new motto is. And if you integrate equity into all of these planning approaches or platforms, you will really make towards that positive contribution side of it, and not just have businesses hide behind the photo op CSR, but really engage with the communities that they work with and operate with. So there are just a few thoughts to kick this off.
Shalanda, do you have a response? Please.
Okay, great. That was disabled mute, and I went on mute just to be able to hear Vivek okay. Yes, well, one of the things that I encounter a lot is now that equity has become a thing, and as Vivek said, corporate social responsibility, it's now the triple bottom line, and how can we do good for the planet and do good for people as well. There are just a lot of different understandings we mean when we say equity, what we mean when we say justice. So, even though it's becoming a part of the lexicon, I want to push people to really get clear about what it is they mean. And, what do they mean by inclusion? Inclusion for whom, right? And who's going to be at the table? What do we mean by participation and when? And, let's make sure that what we're doing is also not performative, but that it is actually meaningful. And so, again, Vivek, we're going to have a great conversation at some point, because I really just align well with a lot of your comments, and the work that you're doing just seems really interesting. So I think we need to very much create some baseline around what we mean by justice, what we mean by equity, and really hold ourselves accountable to those things. And so I know, again, at the federal government level, we're committed. I am working hard every single day to ensure that we have those common tools, that common language. When I talk about environmental justice, when I talk about climate justice and energy justice, I want to be very clear with people about what that means. And also, once the engagement is done, once the conversation has been had, it doesn't stop there, right? It's about ensuring that we're asking the right research questions. I mean, DOE is fundamentally a research and development agency. We send research dollars out the door asking the hardest questions. We need to be sending research money out the door, getting people to do research on equity and justice and getting back to us about what a just transition looks like. And we also, I'm hoping, will be moving into a deployment space. So after that engagement, what did the community tell you about where to site that facility? What did the community tell you about the kind of benefits that would really help them in this with this deployment? So we got to go beyond participation. It has to be meaningful. And we also have to go beyond. We have to make sure that what we're doing is not creating harm. And so those are key elements for me of equity and of justice. And we also need to make sure that those who've been left out, I mean, this is the equity piece. Those who have been left out and left behind and been harmed are at the front and are centered in our conversations. And so again, I'm working hard every day to make sure that happens.
Thank you so much for that. I certainly didn't mean to cut you out of answering the final question.
No, not at all.
So we have an opportunity for maybe one or two questions. I want to introduce Allison Wilson, the Institute for Sustainable Communities communications lead, who's going to help us through this chance to hear from our audience. Allison?
Thanks, Dion. Yeah, we're going through the chat now to see what sorts of questions are coming in. Okay, here's one, and this one is for Shalanda Baker. Hopefully, Justice 40 is the beginning of a sustained effort. What do you hope to see Justice 40 ultimately evolve into?
Oh my gosh, love the question. Love it so much. I also agree. I think it's the beginning. And I just want to shout out Dion here for her hard work and amazing leadership on Executive Order 12898, which was the executive order on environmental justice in the 90s. And that was a watershed moment for the environmental justice movement. I think we're hitting another watershed moment for the climate movement, where we're beginning to center equity in that movement. And so what I'd love to see is not only that we win, right, and that we actually deliver on the promise, because I think the president has said that Justice 40 is really an economic development tool, that this is going to transform our economy. This is going to, lift up those communities that are in deep poverty, lift up those communities that are struggling. And so the climate investments are about transforming our economy. We are moving into a clean energy economy. And so I want to see that happen. I want to see us win, but I also want to see companies step in and say, well, wait, how am I doing business? Right. And so let's move markets. Let's move let's move the clean energy industry into the direction of equity and justice by using our levers in the federal government. And I already know, last night I was in a conversation with a lot of great leaders, and there were companies who said, we're thinking about things like the circular economy. I mean, that sounded outlandish a couple of years ago. Like, what do you mean? And they're like, we want to be a closed loop system. We want to operate in a way that's responsible. I think similarly, companies will be looking for ways they can really make an impact on the equity and justice side. And so we have to lead. We have done big things, hard things before in the federal government. We sent multiple people to the moon, right? Like, that seems really hard and outlandish. And here we have an opportunity to create true equity, lasting equity and justice in our society, which some people think is impossible, but I really believe it's so much in reach. So very excited about being a part of this.
Thank you very much. Allison, do you think we have time for one more question before we close?
Sure, and I want to thank Carla McAllister for that question. We've got one more question, and I wanted to pull one that was for Vivek so that we're being fair. Vivek, this question is from Michael Blumenthal, who asks, do you think that India is moving fast enough to really get to clean energy and cut greenhouse gas emissions? Will we get there?
Well, if you would travel back here in India, you would know all of these announcements are a big deal. You know, on paper they may look a bit ambitious, they may look a bit here and there, but when you see the challenges that the country is facing and how diverse the country is and how inequitable the country is, with people below poverty lines or having lack of access to electricity or even mainstream, manufacturing or livelihood opportunities, and even on the farming side, like I said, fragmented holdings. India is moving really fast, and I myself couldn't have imagined this a year back or even a year and a half back with these kind of ambitions coming in. And just what makes me more comfortable is we are not just looking at a net zero goal, which is somewhere out there in 2070, but we also have concrete, robust commitments right up the alley, right up in 2030, to keep a check on us and trying to see how the progress has been. So there is a concrete plan with a robust, structured, deliverable midterm before looking at the larger goal in place. So I do think we are moving fast, and we are bringing in that balance to make it inclusive. Being fast is great, but being fast and inclusive should be the best way out.
Thank you very much for that, Vivek. Allison, I think we are at time. So I want to take the last couple of minutes to close out and thank our brilliant and experienced presenters. So thank you, Shalanda and Vivek, and thank you to everyone in the audience. Thank you, Catherine, for your technological prowess in helping us through this last hour. We appreciate everyone for joining us today and being part of today's conversation. We've heard some great context and perspective from Shalanda Baker and Vivek Adia on the President Biden administration's approach to climate action and the ways that climate action are being worked on by the Institute in India. So we've got perspectives from the global North as well as the global South. We've learned something about the ways policy and investments and community collaboration are at work to support equity and environmental and climate and energy justice for communities. I want to deeply thank both Vivek and Shalanda for joining us today and sharing their expertise and the promise that they both bring to the changes that we know are needed to ensure that communities are resilient and able to bounce forward from environmental degradation and climate change disruption. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, please visit sustain.org. You'll find the link in the chat. Also, please sign up for the Institute's newsletter while you're there. We'd be excited and happy to share all our news with you and keep you engaged in any way we can in working together collaboratively to move a positive climate change agenda. In closing, this event is recorded and will remain available on the United States Climate Action Center's YouTube channel. I'm Dion Ferris, President of the Institute for Sustainable Communities. Thank you, everyone, Shalanda and Vivek, for tuning in.